Good morning, everybody. So glad to see you here. It's kind of nice to have a change in weather, isn't it? It sort of brings a different kind of optimism, I think, into our lives. The winter is going to be in the rearview mirror not too long from now, and this gets us thinking about spring. It's also now the second Sunday in the season of Lent, this 40-day period where we make our way very intentionally, purposefully, thinking about our dependence on Christ. We always want to do that, always want to keep that in the forefront, but especially when we are in this season of Lent and we begin with Ash Wednesday and we think about being very much mortal creatures, finite in our lifespan, our dependence on God and our dependence on Christ through this whole season and leading us up to Easter Sunday. You know, Easter is probably not the same if we don't do the necessary work in Lent in preparation to get us to that time period. You know, in some ways it reminds us of the season of Advent, another season of preparation and of anticipation. Advent is sometimes talked about as a miniature season of Lent, similar in many ways, but also one where we are probably more upbeat, more positive in the way that we are thinking about things, in excitement about Jesus' birth. In Lent, this is the slow path of Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, to his crucifixion, and to that Saturday, which is maybe the hardest day of the whole church year, that day of grief, of despair even. But we know how the story ends, and we know as people of hope, we will emerge as part of the resurrection story on Easter Sunday. So we find ourselves now in the second Sunday of this season of Lent. And we have this year chosen to study a text that I think is very appropriate for Lent, but not always a text that gets associated with Lent, and that is the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount captures a few chapters in the Bible, and we're going to be reading out of Matthew in just a moment. Last week, we started the Sermon on the Mount by talking about the beginning part, which is a series of blessings, which we call the Beatitudes. Now, that word beatitude does not appear anywhere in Scripture, but it means a series of blessings. In fact, it's interesting, when Jesus says, "Blessed are those who," we talked about last week about how blessed are actually means a blessing in not the sense of just happy are those or good fortune is with those, but it actually has a deeper spiritual significance, a religious connotation to it. God is on the side of is another way of saying, blessed are those who. And I want to thank Stephen Ingram for delivering that wonderful message last week and doing so in a pinch. I know you all appreciated him beginning our Lenten series last week, and especially on very short notice. I came down ill. Trust me, you would not want to have seen me on this stage. I might have passed out or turned green in front of you, but we are grateful. Stephen, thank you again for doing that last week. And just on a few hours' notice. So Stephen is a real gift and a blessing to our church, and you know that. So blessed is Stephen Ingram, for he can step in and deliver a wonderful sermon in very short notice. So thank you, Stephen. So we heard the Beatitudes last week. We heard those blessing passages. Today we're going to go into something that is traditionally called the antitheses. Now, you know antitheses, a thesis and an antithesis, right? The thing and then the opposite of that thing. And we hear that today because we are going to hear Jesus start off, instead of blessed are those who, we are going to hear a series of sayings where Jesus says, you have heard it said, but I say to you. So you have heard it said, the thesis, and then but I say to you, which are typically understood as the antitheses. So be listening for that today. I'm only going to get into one of the so-called antitheses, because there's too many for us to read in their entirety this morning. But I'm going to read the setup to those, and then I'm going to read the first one. And I want you to be paying special attention to both the setup and how that antithesis is structured. So starting in Matthew 5, I'll be reading, picking up with verse 13, and we'll continue on through 26. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but it is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard it said in ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court. With him or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So from there, Jesus goes on to give more of these so-called antitheses. He then talks about adultery, and he goes on and he talks about divorce and taking oaths and retaliation when somebody wrongs you. He goes on to talk a little bit more about justice even. And it's interesting because when you listen to these texts, when you listen to these antitheses, it's pretty clear that what Jesus is saying isn't the opposite or the antithesis at all. It's actually a misnaming of what is actually taking place. I mean, is Jesus saying something in response to what is being offered? Yes, absolutely. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But truly I tell you, and then he goes and he offers something not opposite, but something in addition. You hear the difference? I mean, he's not saying, an antithesis to me at least would be, here is what has been said, and I am going to now tell you the opposite of that thing. You have heard it said, do not kill. But I'm telling you, it's okay to kill. That would be the antithesis. He is saying, you have heard it said, but truly I tell you, let's take it a step further. And so we could call these things a lot of different names, and Amy Jill Levine, who many of you are reading her book and studying it now with your small group during Lent, she calls them extensions, which I actually think is a much better name than antithesis, because Jesus is offering an extension on something. So why does he do that exactly? Well, I think the key lies in the beginning of how he sets up that first teaching for that first extension. He says, I have not come here to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. You know, that's a fascinating statement because so many times I think what we think is, oh, Jesus came and he changed the laws and he liberated us from the oppressive law that is before us, and now we can live our lives very differently because we have God's grace extended to us through Jesus Christ. And that's not entirely incorrect, but I think it's more appropriate to recognize that Jesus is saying, look, you have the law. You have an understanding of the law and how it has been described to you. You have your customs and how you have interpreted them throughout the centuries. But I am coming to you now, and I am going to tell you how I will interpret those laws. And I want you to recognize that when I do that, I am going to take it a step further. I am going to add an extension onto that. Now, I do think that that is a critical distinction, because Jesus is saying, you have interpreted it in a particular way, or your rabbis, your teachers, your elders have interpreted it in a certain way to you, but now I am passing it on to you in a different kind of way of understanding that. So take, for example, one of the first ones that he talks about. You shall not kill. Well, he says, I'm going to tell you how to expand upon that. And it was the one that I just read, right? So if you are concerned with getting to the point where you would be so angry with someone else that you might actually take their life, let's back up a little bit and do something else. Let's add some more extension onto that and think about this. How about we don't ever let it get to that place? How about we don't let it ramp up to that point? How about you consider instead, if you are thinking about killing someone, you first should have stopped. And before you ever came to worship, before you ever offered a gift at the altar, before you ever stepped foot on holy ground, maybe you should have gone and reconciled with that person that you had a grievance against. If you go and you ask every time, ask yourself, am I in an emotionally and relationally healthy place to be able to worship God fully? Then you should be able to say that I am not at odds with someone else. I am reconciled with my enemy. I have cleared things up, and now I can come forward with a clear conscience. You know, it's the same way when we have communion on Communion Sundays, and we offer a prayer of confession beforehand. It's a way of saying, I'm not going to come and to receive the sacrament today with an impure heart. Instead, I want to be asked to be forgiven. I want to be reconciled with my neighbor. I want to be coming clean-hearted before God. And once I have that forgiveness, then I can come and receive that gift. That's just a way of us practicing in the church today what Jesus is teaching here in this particular passage. You got a problem with somebody else? Fix it. Mend that relationship, and then come forward and offer this. I have several colleagues who are a part of a night walking ministry here in the city of Birmingham. And the night walking ministry is one that has been modeled after other cities who have done this successfully. But the idea is that leaders in the community, and particularly faith leaders, gather together and they walk the streets in some of our more troubled neighborhoods late at night. And as they walk, they have conversation with the people who are gathered on the corners or who are sitting on porches or stoops outside of their buildings or houses. They have conversations. They strike up conversations and meaningful relationships with people. It's walking the beat, if you will. And what they do is they have their ear to the ground, and they know what's happening, and they know who's having conflicts or arguments with other people. They hear rumors about things that may be ramping up and escalating quickly, and they seek to try to diffuse that or to pass that information on to law enforcement. And what they have found time and time again is that if they can go and they can be a bridge builder between two factions or individuals who are having a problem with one another, that they are able to pour water on that flame and actually begin to diffuse the situation so that they prevent a violent act from taking place. The numbers on these initiatives in cities where this has been successful are staggering. They have found that they do incredible good with preventing death. Because a murder doesn't usually just happen at random. It happens because there has been an event, a wrong done, honor that has been stolen, a perceived injustice, or it's retaliation for a previous act of violence. And so this is a group of people, of faith leaders who are actually modeling what Jesus is doing, and they're teaching this to other people to prevent further violence. And so Jesus' extension is being practiced in a very real way, in this kind of way of responding. We look at the other examples of the extensions that are being offered there. Jesus says, you shall not commit adultery. That's what the text says. But let's take it a step further. How about this? How about you don't lust after people that you're not married to? How about that for a start? And he says, if you can do that, then you're not going to have to worry about adultery. Again, the author of the book that we've been studying this month says, this is like building a fence around the commandment. Because the penalties, as laid out in the scriptures, are pretty severe. For, if you murder, then you shall be put to death. If you commit adultery, then you shall be stoned. And even in biblical times, she says, the idea was not to execute the judgment if we can help it, but to do all things to prevent it. Because the tradition in Jesus' time was one of mercy, but you got to get to the place where you can avoid having to make the judgment call on whether you extend mercy or you execute the judgment as it is written in the scripture. And so if you build a fence, per se, around it by adding an extension, you're actually leading not only to better results, but somebody doesn't have to face the most severe of consequences and ones that cannot be walked back from. So Jesus says, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but truly I tell you, anybody who has looked at someone else and lusted after them in their heart has already committed adultery. Jesus is preventing the extreme from happening by trying to get us on our guard to not do the thing in the moment that is most tempting to us, and preventing us from further problems or even death. So it's the extension built on. It's the adding to. So when Jesus says, I am coming to help fulfill the law and to carry out the words of the prophets, he's actually doing that, but in a way that God intends. He's reorienting the community to try to see things in a different way. The challenge, though, for Jesus in his time is that the laws as they were written, the letter of the law, is the thing that most people are trying to carry out. And particularly the faith leaders at Jesus' time are the ones who really kind of benefit from this way of being. They say, well, I'm following the law, and anybody who doesn't follow the law should be punished, and that's just the way it goes. But they don't realize that in doing so, they're missing the point. You've heard the difference, of course, between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And this is a culture now that has been deeply ingrained of following the letter of the law, but has missed the spirit of the law. It's sort of missing the forest for the trees kind of argument. Now, if you think about your own life, you can think of probably many examples where that has been the case. You have thought about times where you were caught in that dilemma of saying, well, this is what we should be doing, but this is actually what benefits me or everybody else. You've been caught in one of those situations before, and whether or not you can call it to mind, you know that kind of thing has happened. Or we've also seen the results of when people are driven by the outcome of something, but they missed the point for getting to that point. I think about back in the days when I was studying for exams. And there was a difference between studying for a test where I had been doing all the work faithfully, I had studied for days leading up to the test, and I felt like I really had a grasp of what I was being tested on. And that is a very different experience than I'm cramming the night before, pulling an all-nighter so that I can retain this information for the next 12 hours, regurgitate it all onto the page, and then walk away and promptly forget all of it, right? The former way is the way that it's intended to be. That's the way that the system is set up. That's in the spirit of what taking a test is about. You're supposed to be able to demonstrate that you have a grasp of the concepts. You are able to demonstrate that you understand it and know how it's supposed to work. And the other way is I just need the results to work in my favor. Or what about the people who cheat at something? Well, it's to miss the point, right? You can take steroids and be a world-class athlete, except for the fact that you're not a world-class athlete because you have cheated the system. I always wonder about people who are in the Olympics and they devote their life to something, but the winning part becomes so important that they walk away with the gold medal, but later on we find out that there was this doping scandal and it's stripped away from them, and then their reputation is sullied as well as their medal taken away from them. And I gotta wonder, didn't you have some second thoughts there standing on that podium? Thinking about how I'm not really worthy of receiving this because we'll never know if I could have won it without cheating? These are the things that come to mind as I'm reading about this, and I see Jesus' extensions being applied to so many different areas of our lives. He's basically saying, yes, there's the law, but you miss the point if you only try to live for the law. And the problem is that many of us look at the laws or the rules in Scripture or in society and we say, these feel oppressive to us. This is something that I find a way around. And so we try to find loopholes in these things, or we try to say that this doesn't apply to us, or it'll apply to me once I just do these other things. If I can just accomplish X, then I'm going to live according to the teachings of Jesus. Or after this one indiscretion, I'm going to get my life back on track. And we keep finding loopholes, or we keep finding justification, and we keep finding ways to get around what we're supposed to be doing. But that's not really what the rules are in place for in the first place. My wife, Eleanor, had a professor who taught Old Testament, and one of the things that he said was, when you think about the 10 Commandments, oftentimes we think of those commandments or other laws as things that are meant to control us, like the law's thumb pinning us down. But he said, but you got to remember that these laws for ancient Israel and really for our time are not meant to be that way at all. He said, think about this analogy. It's more like a fence that's around a playground for children. Now, you could look at the fence as something that cages the children. It keeps them in. It restricts their ability to move beyond the fence lines. It keeps them caged in and under control, and all of that's going on, and it's actually kind of cruel. Or you could think about it as, within the fence, the children are perfectly safe. There's freedom to play. There's freedom to run around without fear of being hit by a car. There's no stray dogs that wander into the playground when there's a fence in place. We know who's supposed to be on the inside of the fence and who's supposed to be on the outside of the fence. In fact, the playground fence actually is quite liberating when you think about it in those terms. If the commandments or if the laws and Jesus' extensions are thought of in the same way, they're not meant to be restrictive to us. They're not meant to hold us back. They're meant to provide a framework of safety and liberty and freedom within those rules so we can operate within them. And most of you know that when given the choice and you have broken the rules or violated a commandment or done something that you were not supposed to do, it might have felt enjoyable or pleasurable or like a good thing in the short term, but most of us realize that that is not how we want to live our lives. That's not something we want to form our lives around. And I think most of you have had enough life experience to realize that actually when you are operating within the framework of the fence around the playground, that's when you find yourself most fulfilled. That's when you find life most enjoyable. That's when you sleep the best. That's when you work the best. That's when you find your greatest sense of peace, is when you are operating within those rules. And here Jesus takes the historic rules of ancient Israel and puts his own interpretation on them and says, here's what they're really about. Here's what the spirit of the law is like. And if you can start to do this, not only will you find a greater sense of freedom and enjoyment of life, but you'll put one foot in the kingdom. This is a taste of what just living, holy living, righteous living looks like. This is what life fulfilled is meant to feel like. The problem for us is that we keep putting a couple of toes back in the worldly way of doing things and a couple of toes in the kingdom way of doing things, and we find that it's not quite all of one or the other. But we keep inching toward the kingdom side of things, doing things as Jesus intended for us. He goes on to give several more of these extensions, not antitheses. One of the interesting ones, too, is the one where he tells people that if they're asked to go a mile, why not volunteer yourself for the extra mile? You see, officers and nobility in the Roman Empire had the right, at any time they wanted to pull any citizen of the empire aside and say, I want you to carry my stuff for me. I want you to carry my load, and I have the right to ask you to do that for 1 mile. So, hey, Jewish person, I'm pulling you aside. You look able-bodied. I'm going to be walking down this path out of town. I need you to carry my gear for 1 mile. And you couldn't refuse them. So they load you up with stuff, and Jesus says, if you are asked to go a mile, offer the 2nd mile as well. For in doing so, what happens? You retain your dignity. Something that was meant to be harmful or oppressive to you, now you get to carry your head high. And you get to say, I'm going to do this. And you take back some control of the situation. And all of a sudden now, there is a bigger understanding of what's going on here. This extension now is being built upon a rule that was, but reclaiming it for good, reclaiming it for God. There's a story from a rabbi who, in the 1930s, was a rabbi in Belarus. And this was before he actually ended up fleeing from the Holocaust and settling in Jerusalem for the rest of his days. But the tale goes back to the days in Belarus. And a man who was deep in poverty came to him and posed this question to him. And it's kind of a letter of the law versus a spirit of the law question. He said, tomorrow begins the Passover and the Seder meal. And I need to provide, as a good Jew, this sacred meal for my family. Is it possible for me to use milk instead of wine to fill the 4 cups at the Seder? Now here's the question, right? Is it appropriate? The tradition dictates that it must be wine. But this man does not have wine. He has milk. Is milk an option? The rabbi then pulls out 5 rubles from his purse and hands him these. He doesn't answer the question, but he says, go and celebrate the Seder. His wife was with him and observing the whole thing, and she said, why did you give him 5 rubles? 1 ruble would have been enough money to buy the wine. He said, clearly this question was not about whether it's appropriate to use milk or wine at the Seder. We can see here that by asking, he can't afford wine. And if he can't afford the wine, then he can't afford the bread, and he can't afford the meat that goes along with the meal. 5 rubles will pay for the entire meal, and their family will be able to celebrate the Seder. Sometimes on the surface, these rules, these commandments, these teachings look like a simple yes or no, black or white kind of issue. But when we apply Jesus' teachings and extensions upon them, we see that sometimes we get at the heart of the matter. We see the forest for the trees. We see the deeper issue at stake, as the rabbi in this tale did. He recognized that this wasn't a question about right or wrong, milk or wine. He recognized that this man was living in dire poverty and couldn't do what he was obligated to do for his family as a Jewish man. And he resolved the problem by offering generously out of his purse. There are moments like this in our lives around us all the time, where we will be confronted with a choice. It may be one of ethics, it may be one of justice, it may be one of turning the other cheek or reconciling with our enemies or trying to tamp down lust in our lives and the temptations that face us. But if we look just to the simple surface of saying, what does the law say? Yes or no, black or white, right or wrong, oftentimes we will miss the point. We know that the world, life, and our issues that we face are far more nuanced than that. But if we take on a posture, an attitude, and a spirit of Jesus Christ, and we look at the extension beyond the law or the rule, we will find that we are inching another toe or two closer to the kingdom and living the lives that God intends us to live. Let us carry this message, not just through the Sermon on the Mount and not just through the season of Lent, but take that with us and carry that with us so that our heart might be more and more aligned with Jesus Christ in all that we do. until we are able to put 2 feet firmly in the kingdom.